I just bent my fingernail backwards. Are we working? We are working. All right. I think the internet's working better here. I have no idea if any of you were just watching what just happened. Ow, gosh. But I tried this in the other room, and I was on the other side of a brick wall, and the internet didn't go through it. The router, Wi-Fi. Now I'm in a bedroom. I don't know if you've ever had a college class lecture from a bedroom, but it's the first time for everything. I've never taught a college class lecture from a bedroom. But here we are, and that's what's happening. So here's the story. Here's why I'm in a bedroom. I was going to stream this on Friday night because I was flying out Saturday morning, and I had to sign up for. Well, I had a YouTube channel. This YouTube channel I had it for a while, but to do live streaming, you have to verify your account. So I went in to verify my account, and it said you need 24 hours to verify the account. I'm like, oh, goodness. So that means that I'm going to have to do this in the bedroom at my grandparents' house. So that's where I am. I'm wearing these earphones. That's the only microphone I have. And I get here, and there's no Wi-Fi. So I was thinking I was just going to have to stream it on my phone, even though I have like one bar. And where is my phone? Did I leave it in the other room? There. So finally, I went to Target. I got the cheapest router I could find, plugged it in, got Wi-Fi, so I can at least download stuff and upload. And so I was ready to go, and I go sit out on the porch, and I'm on the other side of a brick wall, and the internet won't go through the wall, the Wi-Fi. So then I had to come in here, and they're all sitting out on the couch watching Westerns or something right now, and I didn't think you'd want to hear that in the background. So hopefully this will work out, and so far it hasn't cut out. It's cutting out every 2 minutes in the other room. So I think we're looking good, and I'm on 5G. Let me check the stream on my phone real quick to make sure that I can see it. Oh, it's working. There I am. What do you know? And it's clear. Someone's watching. I don't know who's watching. There's a chat. You can say hi if you want to. Don't feel obligated. Here's the other thing. I'm flying with 3 kids. We got 3 car seats and a stroller. I already have more to carry than I have hands for. So I didn't want to bring all my books with me either. So I don't have my Bible. I just got my iPad. And then I didn't bring the textbook. I just took pictures of the textbook. So I don't know if you can do that. I have screen like pictures. So I was reading pictures of the book on the airplane and then working on these notes. So hopefully this isn't just a complete bust. Also, as this is on a bed, so if I start typing and you start bouncing, I apologize. Yeah, there we go. It's 9:30 already. And I'm going to go to bed eventually. So hopefully we can get this rolling. I don't plan on talking for 3 hours because I don't have anybody to talk with except for my computer screen here. And it feels kind of weird talking to myself in a bedroom, especially for 3 hours. So tonight we are in Deuteronomy, and I've got my notes over here on the right. I think I uploaded them. Let me check to make sure before I get started here, just in case one of you pops in and wants to follow along. Let's see, info. Yes, Deuteronomy is up there in files under the info tab. If you download those, you can follow along. I took the notes from the previous year, pretty good. So I took those and then I added in some of the outline from the book. So hopefully this all worked out together. The chapter this week was really good. I thought it was helpful. Deuteronomy is a fantastic book. It really is. It's I think Deuteronomy is helpful because it takes the hard stuff of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and it filters it and packages it in such a way that we really understand the whole concept of loving God and loving neighbor, and what that has to do with covenant, and how that points us forward to how Israel was to live, and then ultimately forward into the new covenant. Really, I think Deuteronomy bridges the gap between the Mosaic covenant and the new covenant. That's where you get a lot of those themes. Like we'll see in Deuteronomy 10, speaking of the circumcision of the heart. It's not the sacrifice of bulls and goats that God's interested in, but the heart. And Deuteronomy does a lot to help with that, because I know we did Leviticus and Numbers last week in the same class, and there's a bunch of hard stuff in there. It's just a bunch of laws about how to do this and how to do that. And it's all good stuff and helpful stuff, but it's helpful to have Deuteronomy to take those things and to put it in the package for us to understand why they're there, how they relate to the Mosaic covenant, and then pushing forward into the way that the new covenant picks up on the themes of what Moses is talking about, with the necessity of having a new heart and God's desire for the human heart, carrying us forward to the new covenant and seeing Christ in that. So we're going to be in Deuteronomy tonight, and same thing with every other week. I don't plan on walking through Deuteronomy verse by verse. We're going to fly over it, hit some of the key stuff. It's a big book. It's a good book. But we're not going to be able to hit all of it. I have at the end of well, not the end, actually more toward the middle here, under Roman numeral 4, analysis. You can see sort of the outline of it. I don't have as detailed of an outline as I have for the others, partly because I was in the air and in a bedroom. But I do have Christ in Deuteronomy at the end, where we really bridge those themes between the old and new covenants, and see how Deuteronomy does that. So we'll get to that. So same thing, starting at the top, just like we have each week. The names, the reason Deuteronomy is called Deuteronomy, the Septuagint title, Deuteronomos, Deutero, second, nomos, law, second law. This is the second giving of the law, in the sense that God gave the law to the people that he pulled out of Egypt from Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And then we saw last week that those people were cursed to walk around the desert until they passed away, and their children would inherit the land. And so this second law is them standing on the edge of the promised land, and Moses, who was not allowed to go in because of his sin, remember, standing there preaching to them, really these 3 sermons, a regiving of the law, really pointing to the heart matter. And so Septuagint Greek fathers called it Deuteronomos, second law. So that's where we get the word Deuteronomy. Same thing as we've seen in the previous 4 books. The Hebrew title, Devarim, means words. Deuteronomy 1:1. Right? These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel. And you know what? I didn't check. I can see if I can pull up my Hebrew here. I'm pretty sure that Deuteronomy starts with the word "and" as well. Let me see here. Deuteronomy 1:1. No. Deuteronomy does not start with the word "and." So it just says these are the words. So a little bit different there. All the other ones have been connected together very explicitly by the word "and" at the beginning, at the end of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but Numbers. But there's a break here, and really I guess there should be a break, because we're talking about a break between the old group of people and this new group of people. So these are the words that Moses spoke. That would be what they would call Deuteronomy. I need to get some water too. At that, we take breaks and everything. So I take like a 10-minute break and break out my phone and look at Twitter or whatever. I'm not gonna do that. So, second thing, if you look on the notes, nature. What is the nature of Deuteronomy? Well, it consists mainly of the addresses of Moses to the children of Israel when they were camped on the plains of Moab before they crossed the Jordan. So that's really geographically where they were, right up at the edge of the Jordan River, about to enter into the promised land. We see the conquest of it. We'll see that next week as we get, I think Joshua and Judges are both next week. The conquest of Canaan. It's right there on the edge as they're about to go in, and this is the series of addresses, the sermons of Moses to the children of Israel as they're camped there, about to cross. And what's so important about that is all of the law was given as the way that the people are to live in light of their salvation from the Exodus in the promised land that God was giving them. And so here they are, rubber meets the road, we're about to enter into the promised land, right? Here's how you should live. Here's what your parents failed to do. Here's where they didn't listen. Here's what God has said. And they're standing there. I mean, they can see the promised land on the other side of the Jordan River. And so it's very, very vivid in front of them. When I cross over there, this is how God expects me to live. Of course, that's how God expects me to live here too. But this is the promised land that's been promised to our parents. In fact, you think back, they wandered around the desert for 40 years. We were captive in Egypt for 430 years. Joseph was the one that brought the family there. Isaac before him, or Jacob before him, Isaac before him, Abraham before him. We've been waiting on this promised land for a long time. Here's how God expects us to live in the place that he's given us. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I just have ancient Near East treaties. I probably should have fleshed that out more. The next point really does, but it's very similar covenant language to treaties that you would see in the ancient Near East. The ancient Near East is just that area of land that we would call the Middle East now in ancient times. If you read any textbooks, you're doing any study, you see ancient Near East, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about all of the peoples that lived in that area at that time. I can't think of specific groups of people off the top of my head. I don't know if something like Ur of the Chaldees that Abraham came out of would be considered ancient Near East. I assume it would, but it would be older than this. But you would have Sumerians, lots of different people, ancient Near East, and their way that their covenants were structured very similar to Moses. And so it's not like this would be an unknown type of a format. This is how they formed things. But of course, this was more particular to the heart, and this was given by God. But we shouldn't. If you read, excuse me, if you read scholars, you'll see with this, or even in stuff like zeitgeist theory, or if you've heard of that, where they'll say, like Dionysius or Osiris, the stories of the coming of the gods are very similar to the coming of Christ. And so it must be that the gospel biblical writers took those stories from ancient texts and just used them for their own. And of course, it's ridiculous when you start looking at those stories. They're nothing like the Gospels. But people will say, well, Moses is just taking a similar format to how everybody in the ancient Near East worked. And so we shouldn't see this as any different than a Sumerian covenant treaty or an Urian, I don't know how you say that, treaty. That this is just something, and for some reason this one lasted longer than everything else. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case that we would see similarities. Of course we would see similarities. We would see, you could say the same thing about, Acts, for example. It's a history book and it's written in Greek. There's plenty of other history books written in Greek. That doesn't mean you would discount Luke's writings as not true because he wrote in the same language and in the same way that history writers work. Just how Moses worked here. So if you see number C under nature, I keep pointing at it, but you can't see my paper. There's a quote here. The idea of covenant was important throughout the Pentateuch. The parallels between the ancient Near Eastern treaties and certain covenant passages on the Old Testament are undeniable, but Deuteronomy is unique in that we have an extended portion of scripture structured literarily according to an ancient covenant. The Hittite suzerainty treaties of the second millennium BC are the closest parallel to this structure. I think if you look in the book, let's see if I can do this. If you look in the book on page 143, there's that chart figure 6.1, Deuteronomy at a glance. I laid out the breakdown of Deuteronomy there under point C for you. But if you look, it's the same thing as in figure 6.1. They just have some extra material where they take ancient Near Eastern treaties and how they echo. There's the title, the prologue, the historical prologue, the stipulations, document clause, public recitation, blessing and curses. That's how they would lay out their treaties, their covenant. And that's exactly how Moses laid it out, just through his superscription of the book, which is, oh goodness, I closed it. What did I do? 1 through 4. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizhab. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month. Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him in commandment to them. And after he defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in the Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and in Edrei. So there's your superscription. He's giving you the situation, the time, the date, what's just happened, when it happened, all that stuff right there, just like an ancient Near East treaty would work. You keep going. You've got the historical prologue. So Moses' first sermon he gives, and whoever, Jason DeRucci did this chapter, he titled it Moses' first sermon, God's past grace and Israel's covenant future. Looking back toward their God's past grace to them, which he does in verse 5 of chapter 1 through 4:43, and then looking forward to Israel's future. And then stipulation, his second sermon, the nature of lasting covenant relationship. This is what life should look like. These are the stipulations in the treaty. The document clause, sermon 3, a paradigm for a new covenant after exile. Public recitation, Moses' arrangement for the future, including his warning song. He sings this public recitation. And then at the end, Moses' final blessing and death relates to blessing and curses. And of course, he adds a postscription. It's not like it's word for word exactly the same, but no treaty is going to be exactly alike. But he laid it out in the fashion that the people of the ancient Near East would understand. Oh, he's talking about a treaty, right, between one party and another. Particularly in this, when he's talking about the party of Yahweh, God, and the people of Israel. So kind of cool the way that's laid out. And then D there, the structure of Deuteronomy seems to have been borrowed from the ancient treaties, but comparing God's relationship to Israel with the Hittite king's relationship to his subject nation has limitations, obviously, right? The parallel between Deuteronomy and the Hittite treaties has to do more with form and structure than it does with actual content. This is where your liberal scholars will take things too far. They always take things too far. That's the nature of liberalism when it comes to theology, taking things too far, right? But there's the comparison between God and the Hittite king and the people of Israel and the Hittite people, for example. That's it. That's the comparison between one greater subject talking to the lesser subjects and the way that the treaty is laid out. what they'll do is they'll take something like that, and they'll say, well, it started out as the Hittite kings of the people, and then over time it grew into a thing where the Hittite king became a god figure, and roll it down the millennia after millennia. Well, the Hittite king became Yahweh, and all this whole thing, and now we have this sovereign, all-powerful being who just at one time was a king. They just take things too far. They always do that. So we're not going that far. We're not taking all those parallels. We're just saying the way that Moses laid out the book is the same way that ancient Near East treaties and relationships would be laid out in the content. So kind of cool, just understanding that Deuteronomy has a historical precedent. So Roman numeral 3 takes, what I did is I took, these are the key themes from Deuteronomy, and I love his key themes. He calls them in the box at the beginning of each chapter, the author of, and then these bullet points for what the themes that the author was going after. So I just call it key themes because I'm unoriginal and not very creative. And I try to stay consistent in the notes from one week to the other. Maybe by next year, if they don't fire me, I will find better title for this, but I'm just ripping this straight out of Deuteronomy. So if you've read the text, as you should have, if you want a good grade, obviously, is you've seen this already, but I want to try to go through this a little deeper than he does, if I can. So the key themes, there's 6 of them. The first one is that Deuteronomy provided a constitution for guiding Israel's relationship with God. Provided a constitution for guiding Israel's relationship with God. And so I talked about this just a minute ago in the way that it relates to the ancient Near Eastern treaties, that it looks back at what happened in the past. It clarified for the post-wilderness generation the significance of all that preceded. I think we talked about this last week. But what happened in the wilderness was you had anyone over the age of 20 that God said was going to have to die before they entered into the promised land. And so they wandered around for 40 years until they all died, except for Joshua and Caleb, who went out to spy the promised land and were the only ones that came back with a good report. Everyone was scared. Everyone else was scared and made up lies. And so you've got a group of people who were under the age of 20, 40 years ago, and wandered around with a group of people who were constantly rebelling, constantly at war, death and disease. And I mean, the point of that generation for 40 years was to die. That's what they were out there doing. The reason they were wandering around was God was waiting for these people to die. And so 40 years is a long time, especially if you started out as a 3-year-old kid and all you knew, right? So you were a 3-year-old kid when this started out. Now you're 43 years old. Your parents are dead. All of your friends' parents are dead. Anyone who was over the age of 20, 40 years ago is dead. And you're going, what in the world what is this about? What are we doing? What are we doing here? Why are we standing at the edge of this Jordan River? Maybe I've heard the word promised land. Maybe mom and dad were upset about what happened and they taught me that they did something wrong and now they needed to die in the wilderness. But I think what you see already, just right after Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, is that the first generation of people who were saved out of Egypt already were not teaching their children what they did right, what they did wrong, who God was, why he demanded holiness, that they were to love God and love neighbor. I don't think they taught any of that to their kids. And so what Moses is doing here at the beginning of Deuteronomy in this first sermon and pointing back to what God has done, what did Deuteronomy call it past grace and Israel's covenant future, was to say, just here's what happened. Here's the story. Here's what happened. Here's what's going on. It's mind blowing, right? We talked about last week that this first generation, the one that was wandering around and died, witnessed the greatest thing multiple times that human eyes have ever seen, short of, perhaps the cross, resurrection, and transfiguration of Jesus. I mean, they saw the 10 plagues of Egypt. They saw the angel of death passing over the houses that had blood on the doorposts. They saw 1 million people walking out of Egypt with all the gold and jewelry of Egypt is handed over to them, protected by a pillar of fire and smoke, walked through an ocean on dry ground. I mean, the greatest army at the time, Egypt, destroyed as the walls of the sea smashed in on them, standing at the base of Mount Sinai while the mountain is literally blowing up with fire and smoke and lightning and thunder, told that anybody touches it, they're going to die. They had seen Aaron and the people with the golden calf, and God killing a whole bunch of them. And then they'd seen water come from rocks. They woken up every morning and had food on the ground for them. In numbers, they had manna and they had quail. They had meat, fresh meat in the morning. They'd seen the scene at Kadesh Barnea when the sons of Korah rebelled, and God opens up the earth and swallows something like 3,000 people. They had seen the greatest things that human eyes have ever witnessed, and that was the generation that had completely abandoned everything and had not given any of this to their children, and were the ones who were just salty walking around the wilderness waiting to die. And so Moses, I mean, think about the work that Moses had to do. He had a lot to unpack for them. He had a lot of explaining to do, what exactly God was doing, why their parents were sentenced to death. I mean, that's what they were. It was 40 years of death row inmates, and the children of these people walking with them. And so that's what they were doing. And Moses was clarifying for the post-wilderness generation, that's the second generation, the significance of all that preceded, that this is important. This was important stuff, and that is vitally significant for what God was doing in his program of bringing the seed of Abraham into the promised land. That's the first thing. The second thing, provided the later writers with a lens through which to interpret Israel's covenant history. That's what I was talking about. Excuse me. Sorry, I don't know if you have headphones on right now. Probably blowing up your eardrums every time I cough. Thing's still not gone yet. It's almost gone. Not yet, though. But that's what I was talking about with Deuteronomy, bridging the gap between the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and the new covenant. It gave the lens, this internal, this almost like an internal viewing of the heart of Israel in the time of the old covenant. To give a lens, I just realized that says lens, like I'm lending money. I meant lens, like these right here, a lens through which to interpret Israel's covenant history, so that writers like Paul and Peter, like Peter in 1 Peter 2, we were looking at last week, can look back at this generation and talk about the people who were called not my people, right? Who would, Hosea 2:14, therefore be called my people, or who were called no mercy would be called mercy. Be able to understand that the issue was not their failings, that they weren't necessarily doing the right thing. That was evidence of a deeper problem, that they had a heart issue. That's the lens that Deuteronomy provides the old covenant, that the New Testament writers take and run with and say, this is the issue, that there's hard hearts, right? And Moses uses the word throughout Deuteronomy, stiff-necked people. Paul picks up on that and calls them a stiff-necked people. That's what it works for. That's why Deuteronomy, I think, is such a fantastic book, is it takes the hard stuff of the law and it gives us this way that we as New Testament readers really look at things through a biblical lens, looking deeper than just the actions into the heart of stuff. That's how Paul and all the New Testament writers wrote. And it seems to me, and I think this is right, that they took Deuteronomy as their cue to do that. Of course, carried along by the Holy Spirit inspired writing, all of that stuff. That's the second thing. The third thing is served as a document of covenant renewal for all those that would live in the promised land. Very important. Again, you've got these kids who didn't quite know what was going on. I think probably is the best way to understand it. But Moses walked through everything again. Deuteronomy is a good book in that it packages up Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but it's another hard book that we're reading these laws again. As in Deuteronomy, we're reading second law. We're talking about these laws for a second time. And so Moses walks through them again, and you have this at the end, this blessing. What did Jeruchi call it? Final blessing and death. The public recitation, the warning song, where they get to say, after hearing all of this again, yes, we will commit ourselves to this. And goodness, we can see what happened in the past, and we can see how serious God is about this, and we don't want to do that. We want to live right. So Deuteronomy serves that. Deuteronomy is number 4. Deuteronomy's exposition of the earlier covenant materials would be a guide governing life in relationship to Yahweh until the promises given to Abraham were fulfilled. Again, these things were a guideline. And Deuteronomy as a list of, as 3 sermons of Moses really serves as exposition. You can think of Deuteronomy as the sermon notes on these previous 3 books, or 4 books. Genesis is obviously included. I just keep saying Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, because those are the ones where we're really talking about the laws specifically, not just the history of creation and back to what God was doing with Abraham. These are the sermon notes, and they're taking these, and these work as a guide to govern life in relationship to Yahweh on a deeper level than just do this. Here's what your heart should look like, right? Deuteronomy 10, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart. Well, how do we do that, right? Moses emphasized, number 5, that Deuteronomy would still be important in the age of restoration. Look at this, Deuteronomy 30, verse 8. Get there. Can't just flip the page. I gotta tap on a screen. Let's start in verse 6. Wait a minute. Why isn't this changing? Don't start in verse 6. I think I need to update Logos. It's like not working. What did I say? 30? Deuteronomy 30. Verse 8. Oh, let's just start back in verse 1, because this is an important section that parallels chapter 10. Here's what he says. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, we'll get to that too. Notice the word when. And when all these things come upon you. Now, God is saying this through Moses, that when means this is going to happen. Well, what? The blessing and the curse. We'll get to that. Which I've said before you, and you call them to mind among the nations where the Lord your God has driven you. Not a good sign. And return to the Lord your God. That's good. You and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, and with all your heart and with all your soul. Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you, and the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers, And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and that you may live. Right here, we're talking new covenant terms, right? Here's what he's going to do. After this restoration, he's going to bring you back. In this restoration, he's going to bring you back. And what he's going to do is not just change your behavior, but he's going to change your heart and the heart of your children, so that with the purpose that you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, which is the purpose of all of this anyway. Verse 7, and the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes and enemies who persecute you. Verse 8, here's where we're going. And you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep all his commandments that I command you today. So we're talking restoration. We're talking new covenant terms here, right? New covenant, I will put my spirit upon you. I will give you a new heart. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, we're talking new covenant language here. The word new covenant hasn't even been mentioned yet. We're still in the giving of the old covenant right now, but he's looking forward to the new covenant, and he's saying, this is what it's going to look like. New heart, that you'll be able to serve God with all your heart, soul, that you'll live. All these curses will go to your foes and your enemies. And you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep all his commandments that I command you today. Meaning, Deuteronomy is still important in the age of restoration, right? So we're in the new covenant now. The Deuteronomy is not a book that we would just cast out and say, none of this matters anymore. It's different, I think, than most people would talk about the Pentateuch. We read it as maybe a history book, or here's what some people used to believe or how they used to think. The way Moses talks about it is, no, now in the church, he doesn't use the word church, but we know that's what he's talking about in the new covenant, that you will keep all his commandments that I command you today. And so under this heading of Deuteronomy provided a constitution for guiding Israel's relationship with God, Deuteronomy also and obviously provides a constitution for guiding the church's relationship with God. We obviously have to interpret it and understand that each of these laws aren't in their same effect now that they were then, because we're not under the old covenant, we're in the new covenant. But the heart of it, the point of it, you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the way that's fleshed out in the new covenant in the church, it's still the same. And that we're able to obey it because the Lord your God has given you new hearts. That's the first thing. I think that's pretty cool. I need to get some water. Can I pause this? Is there a pause button? I don't think there's a pause button. Oh, you know what? Maybe I can text somebody. Mm-hmm. See. All right. I'm going to text Janelle, my wife, see if she can bring me some water. I'm going to sneak her on camera. We'll find out if this works. Okay, so the second thing, the importance of taking God and his word seriously. Let me get to this. Oops, man, I keep doing that. The author of Deuteronomy stressed the importance of taking God and his word seriously. Clearly, the previous generation did not. God said there are blessings and there are curses, and they clearly did not believe him and take him at his word. And here Moses is, after that previous generation had been sentenced to death and the death sentence had been carried out, he's explaining to the people of God here in Israel the importance of taking God and his word seriously. I hear it coming. I don't think he's paying attention. Sorry. We've been going for 40 minutes. Wow. Who knew you could talk in a bedroom to a computer screen all by yourself for 40 minutes? I don't know. I didn't know that. Can I flip this upside down? Oh, no, I can't. Hang on. Sorry. Go this way. So let's look at this. Life in the promised land would only be enjoyed in a context of surrender, dependence, and trust in Yahweh, in his word. There's no other way to live and enjoy life, I guess you could say, in any other way than in surrender, dependence, and trust in Yahweh and his word. How do I look at Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 3? Here we go. I'm going to get her. Thank you. Oh, yeah, I'm thirsty. Do you want other water? No. She's going to sit. No, I'm not talking. What is in this? Oh, nice. Nice. The mouthpiece tastes like Tylenol with codeine. You going to shake the bed? That's okay. Ooh, I didn't know she was going to drug me too. Okay. That's all right. What did I say? Okay, Deuteronomy 8:3. I'll back up to verse 1. I know I keep putting like verse 2 or verse 3 and then backing up 2 or 3 verses. I should just say verse 1 and following so I don't have these mistakes in the notes. But the whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So 2 things are going on there. First, he starts off by saying that to live well, to multiply, to go and to possess the land that the Lord your God swore to give to you, you must be careful to do what he has commanded you. That's how covenant life in the promised land is going to work, in a context of surrender, dependence, trust in Yahweh and his word. And the people here have seen the opposite. Remember, I know I've said this a couple times now, but you have to think, here are people, these are grown men and women at this point, but these people would have been, some of them born obviously during the time of wandering, and some of them, 3, 4, 5 years old when their parents disobeyed God and were sentenced to death. So here they are as, a 43-year-old, 45-year-old person needing to know what enjoying life in the promised land would be like, but having a pretty stark backdrop, a pretty bright backdrop of what not surrendering, depending, and trusting in Yahweh looks like, right? He said, he humbled you and he let you hunger and fed you with manna. So he brought them out of Egypt. And remember, the first thing they said is, can't we go back to Egypt where at least we had food? Which wasn't even really true. We brought them to a place where they were so hungry that they had to depend on him. And what he did was give them manna every morning. And what he was doing in that was bringing in front of them the importance of understanding that you must take God and his word seriously. So we saw in Exodus manna coming down from heaven, but then we saw it again in Numbers where they started complaining. And so he gave them quail and they complained because they were getting bored of the meat. And it said that the quail started to rot between their teeth. The importance of taking God and his word seriously. He's not a God to be trifled with. The second thing, turning away would be choosing death over life. There's not another good option, right? Of course, this is the best option out there, is to live life well under the surrender, dependence, and trust in Yahweh and his word. That's what we were created for. Of course, we saw in Genesis that man fell, and that's the exact opposite of what we want now. Romans 1, we have suppressed the truth in unrighteousness, and we have worshipped the creature over the creator, and we've not given glory to the one who deserves glory. And so the best choice out there is to surrender, have dependence and trust in Yahweh, and live well in the land that he's given. But it's not like there's a second choice out there of, well, it's not as good in the land around Canaan, but at least it's a second choice. No, turning away would be choosing death over life. Look at chapter 30, verse 15. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you're entering to take possession of it. There's the first choice. You can love the Lord your God, obey him, keep his commandments and statutes and his rules, and you will live and you will multiply, and the Lord will bless you in the land you're entering. It's pretty good. Verse 17, but if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you're going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. Those are the two options. And of course, we just read at the beginning of chapter 30, and when all these things shall come upon you, the blessing and the curse, meaning they're not going to choose life, they're going to choose death. But the importance of taking God and his word is literally a life and death choice for the people to make. The life and death choice for the people of Israel here to make in Deuteronomy. It's a life and death choice for us to make here under the new covenant in the year 2019. The third point, fearing the Lord is the generator for holy living. True obedience grows out of a heart that reveres Yahweh's supremacy. I'm sure we've mentioned this in the previous 4 books, but this again is a problem that the Jews had in Jesus' day. It's the natural problem. It's the problem that we naturally go to. It's the problem that everybody's naturally dealt with for the past 4,000 years, is we think that holy living is going to generate righteousness. That obedience creates a heart that reveres Yahweh's supremacy. But that's not the way it works. Fearing the Lord is the generator for holy living. The heart issue that delivers the action. Obedience grows out of a heart that reveres Yahweh's supremacy. We're not going to have time to read all of these verses throughout all of these notes, but these are important right here. We're going to spend some time in Deuteronomy 6 in just a minute under the next point. Now, this is the commandment, verse 1. This is the commandment, the statutes and the rules the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you're going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God and your son, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Verse 2, that you may fear the Lord your God, by keeping all his statutes and commandments. And so, the fear of the Lord your God is evident in keeping his statutes and commandments. But keeping the statutes and commandments does not cause us to fear, or the fear just means revere God. Fearing the Lord is the generator for holy living. And holy living is the evidence of fearing the Lord. And the next point, 4, faith is the natural outgrowth of fearing Yahweh. Faith is future oriented. Derucci talks about this. Oh, which page is it? At the bottom of 145, faith in the God of promise is the natural outgrowth of fearing Yahweh. For a true encounter with the living God proves both his believability and the desirability of lasting relationship with him. Throughout the Bible, faith is future-oriented in that God's people trust him to accomplish for them what they cannot do on their own. Faith is future-oriented in that they're believing that God is going to do something. Faith is not believing that God has done something necessarily, although that is sometimes true, but it's future-oriented in that God has given a promise and you believe that he is going to accomplish that. That's what, excuse me, that's what's going on in Genesis 12, 15, 17, 22, right? Abraham believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead. That's why he was willing to sacrifice him. It's not that he thought that God was going to stop him from killing Isaac. When God said, sacrifice Isaac to me, Abraham believed that God was going to raise him from the dead. Why? Because God had promised that he was going to make a great nation of him, and this was the son through whom he said he was going to do it. And the only way to reconcile the death of Isaac and the making of a great nation through Isaac is that God would have to raise him from the dead. And so this is a future-oriented faith that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. And of course, Abraham believing God, Genesis 15, God counted to him as righteousness. That's what Paul picks up on in Romans 4. Faith is future-oriented, a heart of God dependence rather than self-reliance is the root. Faith is not faith in yourself. You can't have faith in yourself in this sense. It's a natural outgrowth of fearing Yahweh. It's a heart of dependence on God. And that obedience is the fruit. Oh, I forgot a parenthesis there, didn't I? Obedience is the fruit of faith. We don't have to go to, oh, what did I do? We don't have to go to Deuteronomy 29. We just read it in Deuteronomy 6. We saw it in Deuteronomy 30. By keeping all his statutes. That's what flows out of the heart of faith. It's what James says, right? In James chapter 2, that you are justified by your works, not in the sense that you are declared righteousness in God's sight by working, but that the justification or the mark of true faith is that it works. It's the evidence of saving faith. Number 4, therefore, there is no true obedience without faith. We will look at Romans 14. Oh, I can type this out. I'm not used to typing to find the verse I'm looking for. Sorry. Romans 14, 23. This might be a passage that you wouldn't think fits with this, but it does. Paul's talking about food and whether one brother thinks eating this food is sinful or this food is not. Verse 20, do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It's good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. Faith that you have, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who has no reason to pass judgment on himself for what he approves. Right here, verse 23. But whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith, for whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. That Paul takes it so far to say, if you do anything not from faith, it's sin. That true obedience, you can't have true obedience without faith. True faith works, and the outpouring of that faith is evidenced in good living in the way that we would talk about in Deuteronomy. What is good living? Well, it's living according to the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God has given you. And so faith is the natural outgrowth of fearing Yahweh. That's the second of the key themes. The third, and here's where we'll go to Deuteronomy 6, and we'll stay here for a little while. I think this is probably one of the most important chapters in Deuteronomy, and one that really points forward, especially through Proverbs and into the New Testament. It's the centrality of love in one's relationship with God. Of course, we know, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love toward God and neighbor is the essence of covenant relationship. You want to boil all of this down to what we're talking about. We're talking about love of God and love of neighbor. Why can we do that? Well, that's what Jesus does. That's what he said. All the law and the prophets hang on this. And when he says all the law and the prophets, he's pointing back to what we're talking about in the introduction class, the way that they would talk about the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Torah, the Ketuvim, and the Nevi'im, the law, the prophets, or the law, the writings, and the prophets. What does all the Old Testament hang on? What wraps it all up? What can you package up and tie up nicely? What does it look like? Love of God and love of neighbor. So the centrality of love in one's relationship with God is a key theme of Deuteronomy. That's where, again, talking about the bridging of the old covenant and the new covenant. What is that bridge? What's the lens that Moses provides to the new covenant writers in the New Testament? Looking at the heart and what's going on there, specifically the centrality of love in one's relationship with God. Now this here, look at Deuteronomy 6. Oh, that's Romans. Deuteronomy 6. Love of God is to be life encompassing. This has to start in verse 5. I want to go back to verse 4 to explain why I think these series of 3 sermons that Moses is giving to the people of Israel is to a group of people who had grown up having no clue what's going on. These parents did not teach these children. They were wandering around in the desert. They were obviously, most of them, not repentant. I'm sure there was plenty of repentance, and I have no doubt that we will see plenty of the first generation of Israelites in heaven. But I think it's pretty clear that a bunch of them didn't. And so here's what Moses does. He just starts at the beginning. He starts from scratch here in Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, you know this is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema Israel, Yahweh Elokeinu, Yahweh Echad. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. What's all this about right there? This is where Jesus goes. Love of God is to be life encompassing. Darushi talked about this. I'm not going to get into it too much because we don't have time. We're already an hour in. Heart, soul, might. He talks about as these concentric circles of one's life. Inner life being the heart, the soul, talking about your whole being, and your might being the way that it spreads out in your use of it. So from the heart to action would be the way that he'd work through heart, soul, might. I don't want to get into that necessarily, but that's where he starts. That this is what you're to know. First of all, Yahweh is our God. He's one God, which could mean he's God alone, which I think it means. It could also mean that he's the only God in the world, which I think it also means. I think you also take it and you get your, not just monotheism from this, but you get your 3 persons in one being of the Trinity from Yahweh Echad. Yahweh is one. That's all later down the line when we get to that in New Testament. Talking about the heart here and love, these words I command you today shall be on your heart. These words here, the words of this book, are to be internalized down to the core of your being. They're to be etched on your heart, right? You shall teach them diligently to your children. They shall be spread to the children. Why did Moses have to tell this generation that they should teach their children these things? Well, I think probably because these people were not taught these things from their parents. Well, why is that? Why would that be the case? Well, the parents were the ones wandering around in the desert, cursed to die, because they didn't take the Lord and his word seriously. The importance of taking God and his word seriously, the previous point. He's saying these things are to be internalized. They're to take over your whole being. They're to evidence themselves in your action, heart, soul, might. Etched on your heart, not literally, obviously. And then they're to be passed on to your children. And not just that, but you shall talk about them when you sit in your house. This shall be the conversation that's on your lips. And when you walk by the way, when you go to the grocery store, this is what you're to be talking about. When you lie down, this is what you're to be thinking about. When you rise, when you stand up, this is what you're to be thinking about. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, meaning the actions that you do shall be flavored with the love of God, because your hands are what do things. That's where actions take place. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes, that the 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 vision, what you see, shall be filtered through an understanding of the love of God. That's what you're looking toward. You're looking toward things with a love of God focused vision. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house. This shall be the theme of your house, and on your gates, this shall be the theme of the city you live in. That's why Derucci calls this love of God is to be life encompassing. He covered everything right there, from the very internal part of your heart to the gates of your city. But you should be known in your city when someone sees you as the one who is completely, what's the word I'm thinking of? Engrossed in the love of God. That's the centrality of love in one's relationship with God. That right there is, I think, that lens that we were talking about before, that the New Testament writers take and use to understand all of the Pentateuch. That it's not like Deuteronomy is divorced from the previous four books, and that God created the heavens and the earth in Genesis, and he found this guy Abraham, and he did some stuff with the family, and then they went into exile, and then he got the people out of Israel, or out of Egypt, and then he gave them a law, and then all that didn't work out, and now here we go with Deuteronomy starting out something else. No, but Deuteronomy is giving a lens by which we're to view everything that took place in the previous four books, that this is what God was doing and his purpose in doing all of that. Not that he's changed the program because it didn't work with them, let's try something else. This was the purpose of that. And of course, he goes on in verse 10, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, as they're standing there at the Jordan River seeing the promised land in front of them, that he swore to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob to give to you, with great and good cities that you did not build, houses full of good things that you did not fill, and cisterns you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, and take care lest you forget that the Lord Yahweh brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It's the Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the peoples who are around you. For the Lord your God is in your midst is a jealous God, lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from off the face of the earth. That this is what you shall be about. I'm putting you in the land that I promised to give you. This land's flowing with milk and honey, in that I allowed a people to live there and build cities and dig cisterns and wells and fill up the storehouses with food and furnish the houses. And you're going to go in and you're going to take all of that from them, and it's all going to be yours. I'm giving it to you. Here's how you should live. Worship me and don't go after foreign gods. That all of this encompassed under the supremacy of God and his sovereignty over all things. The centrality of it is love in one's relationship with God. Now, of course, we know how that works out by almost the beginning of the next book. We're going to do Joshua and Judges next week. By the end of Judges, things are so messed up that it's almost like they hadn't even read Deuteronomy. I think they go into captivity like 7 times. You've got the whole Samson and Delilah stuff going on there, where he gets captured by the Philistines and he has to bring them down and all that stuff because they've forgotten all this. That doesn't mean that this isn't true in the way that they should live. So he takes this, Daruchi does, not Moses, takes this verse, number 3, to love God is to, number 1, remember Yahweh amid the pleasures of life. Verse 10 through 25, we were to keep reading. I'm not going to keep reading it. We were to keep reading it. All of the good things in life, don't allow them to cause you to forget who Yahweh is and what he's done. To love God is to remember him amid the pleasures of life. Also, to love God is to remove all obstacles that could hinder a God-centered existence. That's chapter 7. Now, chapter 7 would be a thing that people have problems with. How could God go in and have these people commit genocide, right? We'll look at that more as we get into the next couple of books. But how should we frame it? How should we understand it? Well, God is taking the people into this land, and he's having them remove all of the obstacles that could hinder a God-centered existence. Now, again, I've said this a few times so far this semester. That point will preach right there, won't it? You just take that and think about it. What things are there in your life that aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves, right? Like, I'm sure there were some pretty cool people among the Girgashites. I don't know anything about the Girgashites or the Jebusites or the Canaanites. They probably had some cool things, some cool inventions, you know. What obstacles are there that you allow to stay in your life that hinder a God-centered existence? And can you say that you were truly loving God in allowing these obstacles to stay in your life that hinder your God-centered existence? Now, of course, you take that and you be careful with it, right? Well, I have a friend in my life who she's always pulling me away from God. And so I read Deuteronomy, and I went into her town and I slaughtered her whole family. Like, well, no, come on. Calm down. But you can see these two aspects. Number one, it's easy to forget who God is and what he's done amidst the pleasures of life. And it's also easy to allow the things in life to hinder a God-centered existence. I mean, that hits us right in today, doesn't it? And so chapters 12 through 26 are all about the how-to. It's all about the how-to. We're still under Moses' second sermon, the nature of lasting covenant relationship. It's all about the how-to. How do we do this? What does righteousness in community worship look like? How do we do it? What is righteousness in community oversight? How do we govern a people righteously so that we can love God in these two ways, by remembering him and removing obstacles. Um, what does righteousness in daily community life look like? The particular details of these things from chapter 12 to chapter 26 may not hit us in the exact same way that it would hit the people of Israel, because we live in a different context and a different time. We don't live in a nation governed by God and the people given under the old covenant. Things are different in that now. But there are certainly huge principles we can pull out on what on righteousness looks like in worship, what righteousness looks like in leading, oversight, governance, being in the way that you lead in your job, or the way that you lead in your family, or whatever righteousness just in living daily life looks like. All of those things are massively important. That finishes up the centrality of love in one's relationship with God. What time is it? 10:45. The fourth thing in these key themes: the perils of sin, the pleasures of surrender, and the promise of grace. I don't have a bunch under here, not because it's not good, but because it's sort of repetitive of what we've already talked about, and so I didn't want to go through all of it again. But you've got these motivations: blessing and curse. Those are motivating factors. Blessing: if you live this way, blessing will take place. If you don't live this way, curse will take place. That there are certain pleasures to surrender, promise of grace. There are certain perils of sin. Again, it goes back to talking about death and life, that there are only two ways to live. These are on pages 150 through the top of 157. Motivation specifically is 151 and 152. He motivates us in certain ways, we know that. Foundation, again, talking about past experience and future grace. You can imagine this second generation where God says through Moses, listen, right? Just listen, right? I say this to my kids sometimes. They do something for the 100th time, and they've gotten in trouble the previous 90 times that they've done it. 99 times, I should say, because I just said 100. And they're about to do it again, and you say, hold on, listen. You know the past experience here, right? It's a certain, I don't want to say talent necessarily, but it's a certain gift to be able to see the failings of another person and learn from it. That's what Moses is preaching to the people of Israel here in Deuteronomy. Look at the past experience. Was wandering around in the desert your whole life? That's all you've ever known. If they're 30 years old, that's all you've ever known is wandering. But what are we wandering for? I remember as a kid reading Numbers and reading Deuteronomy and going, did they not have a map? Like, why are they wandering? It's not that big of an area. And 40 years is enough time to walk around the world a couple of times if you really wanted to. What was the problem? I didn't understand. No, they were wandering. They were forced to wander around as a death sentence. What just happened in my earphone? Am I still working? Made a sound. I think my battery's dying. I have no idea. I might have to switch to the other mic. Can I switch to the other mic? I have no idea. Anyway, I'm going to keep talking. See if that makes a sound again. But their past experience, you say, look, here's what happened. Here's why they were wandering around. Because this is what happened. They didn't listen. And again, this promise of future grace. If you live this way, this is what's coming. Promised land, blessing, land flowing with milk and honey. This future grace that you will have, pointing forward into the new covenant. You know what? I should check. Let me check this stream here. Because if I talk for another hour and I find out that sound didn't record, I'm going to lose my mind. I'm not going to lose my mind. I would just be upset. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello. Oh, it's working. All right. We're okay still. Yeah, there's a foundation. There is a foundation there. They're not going. This is not some unknown. You know, maybe you could say that for the first generation, but you can't say this for the second generation. There was hard-heartedness there, right? That was Israel's problem. Israel's problem was rebellion, unbelieving, stubbornness. To this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. This is what Paul is just weeping about in Romans. That their hearts remain hard to this day. He says, if I could give my own salvation for these people, I would. But their hearts remain hard. The partial hardening has come over Israel. And it's been that way. They've been hard-hearted. At the end of Acts, right, he says, I'm going to take this message to the Gentiles because they will listen. That's been the problem, the hard-heartedness of Israel. That's one of the perils of sin, is that it hardens hearts. Hearts grow harder. That there is pleasure in surrender because God softens the heart and sanctifies. And this promise of grace that He will complete the work. And so God has this program, you could call it, of salvation through judgment. There's a good book by, I can't remember his name. The book is called Salvation Through Judgment, Biblical Theology, James Hamilton. Big book, not that thick. And he talks about God's program of God's program of saving a people, but doing it through judgment, and that He brings people through judgment to bring them to salvation. And that's how He works through the Bible. Again, back to Deuteronomy 30, verse 1. I just want to see that verse again. And when all these things come upon you, that means that in the plan of God, He planned for Israel not to listen and to, I thought my mic went out. That's okay. Plan for them not to listen and to experience the curse. Right? Call to mind the nations to where the Lord your God has driven you. That means you're going to be driven away. You're going to go into exile. And imagine sitting there as an Israelite, as God is giving you this. He's telling you, here's how you live. Here's how it's going to happen. Here's how good it's going to be. All you have to do is listen, surrender, hope in me, trust in me. But when you don't do it, here's what's going to happen. It's saying, this is what your future looks like. Not a possible future, but this is what your future is going to look like. I'm just telling you. I'm predicting what your future is going to look like. When you're driven to the other nations, that God will redeem you out of that. Verse 2, return to the Lord your God and you and your children and obey the voice and all I command you today with all your heart and with all your soul. Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you. That the way he's going to work this out of you, this nation, is to have you fall because of your hard hearts, your sinful hearts, bring you into exile, pull you out and restore you and give you new hearts. That is a plan. It's amazing, but that's how it works. And we see it work. As we go through the Old Testament, we will see this plan of salvation through judgment work all the way up into the New Testament. In chapter 7, you don't have to turn there. This lasting covenant relationship, it's been graced from start to finish. And if you go back and you just think, Abraham was just some dude, right? He's just some dude out there. There's no reason for God to choose Abraham. Abraham didn't look nice necessarily. I mean, I don't know how he looked. I'm just saying his looks weren't the reason that God chose him. It wasn't his wealth, it wasn't his smarts, it wasn't some special something that he had. God just chose him. He placed his grace upon him. That's how it started out. And it worked that way throughout all of the Old Testament. It's grace throughout the whole thing. And you and me now sit here today as believers in the same condition that Abraham was. For by grace we have been saved through faith, not of ourselves, the gift of God, not by works. No one can boast. We are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works, that we may walk in them. Grace start to finish. That's what God's doing in his program. It's what he's always done. That's how he's always worked. That's how he's always going to work. And then the last point here in the key themes, the goal of this, the goal of love, the goal of this whole thing is this God exalting influence on the nations. I think this is one of the surprising things in the New Testament to the Jews in the Gospels that they shouldn't have been surprised about, but they were. When Paul says at the end of Acts that he's going to go to the Gentiles because they will listen, the surprising thing. The Gentiles? They need the Gentiles. What do the Gentiles have anything to do with it? What do the nations have anything to do with it? This has always been about us and us. We're the chosen people. We're the nation of God. We're the ones that all this is about. This has nothing to do with the nation. That's just not true. I mean, just look at chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 5. See, I have taught you statutes and rules as the Lord my God commanded me. You should do them in the land that you're entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as Yahweh, our God, is near to us whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all his laws that I set before you today? There's a reason that God kept them in the world. He taught them statutes and rules the Lord your God commanded you, that you do them in the land that you're entering to take possession of them. Keep them and do them, that they will be your wisdom and understanding in the sight of people. You're a blessing to the nations in that you're following the law of God, and they see it, and they proclaim, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Chapter 26. Oops, that's not a two. Chapter 26, 19, verse 18. And the Lord has declared today that you are a people for his treasured possession, as he has promised you, and that you are to keep all his commandments, and that he will set you in praise and in fame and in honor high above all nations that he has made, and that you shall be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he's promised. It's there. It's throughout the whole thing. He's setting you up as a as a people set on a hill for the nations to see. Now, there's two things, because remember, we're talking the Pentateuch. This really this one book. And the first time we saw nations really was back in Genesis 10 and 11 with the Table of Nations and the Tower of Babel, where God created the nations. And this one particular family and people were picked out of the nations, and the nations existed as this God-hating people. And the nations that surrounded and filled the earth as the people of God wandered around and all that stuff. But then as it progresses and we get to this point where Israel becomes this high nation, the ruling nation in the world by the time of David, right? We get forward to the place where he says, you are going to be a blessing to the nations. And what blessing particularly is that? Well, New Testament, Jesus comes through Israel and becomes for the world salvation, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. It's this blessing to the nations, seed of Abraham is. And so it's not that the nations were forgotten. It's that God's program was to work through Israel in order to save the world. That was the point of this whole thing, one of the major points. That this was the goal, and that's what Deuteronomy is pointing to. The goal of this love, that as you are there existing as a nation, loving God and loving neighbor, the nations will see it and come to know Yahweh as their Savior. And of course, as we read in Leviticus specifically, we didn't get into this when we were in there, Leviticus and some in Numbers, what do you do with the sojourner? What do you do with the person, the proselyte, who comes in and says, I want to be an Israelite? Well, it's not necessarily about ethnicity. It's not about your DNA that makes you an Israelite. It's that you're a worshiper of God. And so there is a process for taking a person and having them become part of the nation of Israel. It's always been about that. It's always been about loving God and loving neighbor, not your DNA. And that the purpose of this would be that this God exalting influence would go to the nations and they would come to know Yahweh as God. Fast forward, Acts chapter 2. You have a confusing of the languages at the Tower of Babel, Genesis 10 and 11. A confusing of the languages and a creation of the nation. Then you get to Acts chapter 2, and you have all of the nations in Israel, right? They're there for Passover. But you have people from all over the world there at Passover speaking a bunch of different languages, not able to interact. And you have them all gathered together, Peter preaching a sermon to them. The Spirit of God comes upon all of them, speaking in tongues so that they can all understand what Peter's saying. You see this, these bookends of the Tower of Babel and Pentecost, this closing of this chapter, where the church as it exists, the people of God, are not created by ethnicity or family background, but that they are all worshipers of God, and that the reason that God created these nations initially was a curse, you could say a judgment, salvation through judgment, as it worked through Pentecost, worked to create a plethora of languages and color and music and styles that would come together and believe Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5. Who do we see seated around the throne but a people of every tribe, tongue, and nation singing the worship of God? That was the purpose of all of this, that God would exalt himself, exalt his son Christ, and that Israel in this program in the Old Covenant would be the one through whom the blessing would come to the world. Of course, they fail in some sense, but God succeeds in another sense, and in an ultimate sense, that he brings the Messiah through the line of Abraham, through the line of Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, and that Jesus is the blessing to the nation. That finishes up the key themes. We've been going an hour and a half. We'll see what other stuff we do. I'm not going to go 3 hours. I hope you're okay with that. I think you will be. You see the analysis here in Roman numeral 4. This is just a breakdown of the book. We don't need to walk through that. The message, Roman numeral 5, very similar to the stuff we went through, this learning from the past and the loving of the Lord. It does emphasize, it does highlight some pretty important stuff, that love appears 21 times, heart appears 46 times, law appears 27 times. This centrality of love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, might, Deuteronomy and Matthew. That's all big. I want to highlight Roman numeral 6 and the role of Deuteronomy, and then look at this section on Christ and Deuteronomy after that. So let me just read these quotes here. The role of Deuteronomy in Roman numeral 6. Deuteronomy is the culminating expression of the Mosaic covenant. As in the previous books of the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy is greatly concerned with law. Here, as nowhere else in the Pentateuch, the underlying principle of the law is love, which characterizes the relationship between God and his people. You think about it, when you hear people talk about law, the word you never hear is the word love, right? In fact, they would epitomize the two. They would put them polar opposites. Love and law are two opposite things. It's just not true. Deuteronomy makes it clear that what underlies the law is love. That characterizes the relationship between God and his people. The concrete imperatives of the 10 Commandments objectify this principle and then receive more specific application in the stipulations of chapter 12 through 26. We looked at that. The basis of the nation's relationship to God flowed from his love for them and from their appropriate response to obedience. When God's people break his commandments, they break the relationship of love. Obedience to God's law is a byproduct of a relationship of love. Love is the essence of the relationship. Law is the natural result. We talked about all this stuff. I thought it was going to be a little bit different, so we'll skip through that. Christ in Deuteronomy. Let's get to this, and then we'll finish up. Christ in Deuteronomy. Christ in the Great Commandment. Deuteronomy 6:5. We actually talked about that too. That Jesus talks about this. This is the greatest commandment. Matthew 22:37. Jesus Christ wants us to love the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit with everything we have, with all of our mind, with all of our being, and with all of our strength. That has not changed, right? That because we're in the new covenant now, that has not changed. No, it's still the same thing. What is the purpose of this? We are to be lovers of God and neighbor. And now in the New Testament, God has disclosed himself in the person of his Son. That's what John 1 says, that Jesus is the very exegesis of the Father. He is the explainer of the Father to mankind. That the God-man, that God came in the flesh, incarnated himself as the God-man, and that his role is one of being the explainer of the Father, so that he tells the disciples, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Not that I am the Father, right? But that I live in the exact way that he would have us live. That I do the very thing my Father would do, so perfectly that if you've seen me, you've seen him, because he would do the same thing. And also we understand Trinitarian nature that's developed throughout the New Testament. And as we look back at the clues in the Old Testament and see, therefore, that we're to be lovers of God, and that we're to love the Father, and we're to love the Son, and we're to love the Spirit as we love God and as one with everything that we have. Matthew 22:39, related to Leviticus 19:18. We should relate to God in absolute love. My earphones just did something weird again. What does that sound? Can you still hear me? I still see it on the bottom. We should relate to God in absolute love to the best of our ability and through the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, and love our neighbor as ourself. But what's happened in the New Testament, how are we to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength? God has supplied us with himself in the person of his Holy Spirit to do the work of causing our hearts to cry out, Abba, Father. That's how we love the Lord our God and love our neighbor as ourselves, and through the work of the Spirit on our heart. Jesus brought these two texts together and said they fulfill the whole law. Christ, the final prophet. Moses says in Deuteronomy 18:18, I will raise up for them a prophet. This is God talking through Moses. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my word in their mouth. My word in their. Okay, I'm still making sound. And he shall speak to them all that I command them. Remember, the Pharisees asked John the Baptist a question when he's baptizing people in the Jordan River. They said, "Are you the prophet who is to come?" Right? John 1:18. Oops, I'm gonna press that button. John 1:18. Are you Elijah? No. Remember these questions that they were asking him? Are you Elijah? No. Are you actually? I don't know why 18's there. 19. They ask, "Who are you?" Verse 20. He confessed, they did not deny, but confessed, "I'm not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" "I'm not." "Are you the prophet?" Deuteronomy 18:18. No. Who are they looking for? They're looking for Jesus. He's the final prophet. He's the prophet who is to come. Which was 18. If I raise up for them a prophet like you, like Moses from among their brothers, I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I commanded him. That's who they were looking for. It's Jesus. Christ is the fulfillment of the law of Moses. The law of Moses includes Genesis through Deuteronomy. Christ is the fulfillment of the revelation of the Creator. John 1, that's what I was explaining. He's the expression of the Father. By him all things were created. For him and through him and to him. Christ is the fulfillment of the covenant of Abraham. Galatians 3:16. He is the offspring of Abraham. He's the one this whole thing has been talking about. Christ is the fulfillment of the covenant at Sinai. Hebrews 10:5. Look at this. This is amazing. Hebrews 10:5. Consequently, when Christ came to the world, he said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired." He's citing Psalm 40. "But a body you've prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you've taken no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it's written of me in the scroll of the book." When he said above, "You have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings," the law here, obviously, these are offered according to the law. Verse 9, then he said, "Behold, I have come to do your will." He does away with the first in order to establish the second, and by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Sinai said we need substitutionary sacrifice to make atonement for sin. And you had sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice, as we talked about. Sacrifices and offerings you've not desired. The blood of bulls and goats you've not desired, but a body you've prepared for me. Psalm 40. It's Jesus who's come to do your will. He does away with the first. He does away with the sacrifice of the blood of bulls and goats. to establish the second. By that will, we've been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ. He is the final lamb who was slain. He is the one that the Day of Atonement was pointing to, where the sins of the people would be taken away in this sacrifice. He's the fulfillment of the covenant at Sinai. Christ is the fulfillment of this whole law. The summary of the law. The messianic prophecies in the law which relate to the first coming of the Messiah can be summarized in 6 key points. These relate either to his person or his work or both. Seed of the woman, Genesis 3:15. The seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. Means seed of the woman, the Messiah would be human, not an angel, nor purely God as God. I didn't read that sentence well when I copied it over. That's not a good sentence. Messiah would be, we would say, fully human, not an angel. Fully God. We'll just say that. You just scratch that out of there. Cut it out. This is what we know about Jesus from the law so far, or from the Pentateuch. The summary of the Pentateuch and understanding Christ in the Pentateuch, what we know so far. Going to be fully human, seed of the woman. Seed of Abraham. Messiah would come from one specific part of humanity. He would be a Jew, not a Gentile. He's coming through Abraham. Seed of Judah, right? Genesis 49. Although there were 12 Jewish tribes, Messiah would come from one specific tribe, the tribe of Judah. This would require the Messiah come prior to the destruction of Jewish genealogical records in 70 AD. The point of this is that we know a lot about Jesus, who he is, from the first 5 books. He's to be both God and man. Although Eve wrongly identified Cain as the Messiah, remember Genesis 4:1, I have gotten a man, the Lord. She clearly understood that Messiah was to be a God man. I have gotten a man, the Lord. Understood the seed of the woman, he was to be a man. Understood she'd gotten that man, and he was the Lord. It just was wrong about it being Cain. He's to be a king. More than once, the symbol of the scepter was used to indicate that the Messiah would be a king. The first one, of course, Genesis 49. The scepter of Judah shall not depart from beneath your feet. The kingly line would come through Judah. He would be a prophet like Moses. We just read that, Deuteronomy 18:18. Messiah would be a prophet, and specifically, he would be a prophet like Moses. That means he would be the greatest prophet to ever live. There are plenty of prophets after Moses, but none like Moses. Remember just the special relationship that Moses had with God, that he would walk up Mount Sinai, or he would walk to the tent of meeting and speak with him face to face, mouth to mouth. They would have conversations with one another. Moses had this special relationship with God that he would speak God's word back to him when he interceded for the people of Israel. Don't put them to death. Remember what you said. Jesus would be a prophet like Moses, in that he would have that same special relationship. Of course, we know it's even greater than that, he himself being God, Jesus, the Son of God, the second person. And finally, we'll close here, the removal of the curse. Although Lamech wrongly identified his son Noah as Messiah, he clearly understood that Messiah, when he came, would remove the curse brought upon the earth by Adam's sin. What's he talking about there? I don't know that we hit that, but let me just point it out real quick. That's going to be Genesis 5. Verse 28, when Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Noah's name means rest. Noach means rest. And Lamech understood out of the ground that the Lord's cursed, back to Genesis 3. This one shall bring us relief from our work, salvation from the curse. uh, he was wrong, obviously. Although Noah was, in some sense, a rescuer, right? So, although Lamech wrongly identified his son Noah as Messiah, he clearly understood that Messiah, when he came, would remove the curse. That Messiah would be the curse remover, the one brought upon the earth by Adam's sin. And so I mean, and those are basic and cursory. There are plenty more. Point being, in these first 5 books that we would either often overlook or think of as history books, or think of as, things not that important, just a bunch of laws and things don't apply to us anymore. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here that point to our Savior, who he is, what he's going to be. If you're in Joshua's time and you're walking around, you know a bunch of stuff about who the Messiah is, what he's going to do, what the promises of God are about him. That he's to be both God and man, he's to be a king, that he's to be a prophet like Moses, and that he has a relationship with God like none other. He's going to be the one to remove the curse from us. The Jews of Jesus' day had no excuse for their lack of knowledge, and we have no excuse for our lack of knowledge either. So I hope that as we've been in these first 5 books of Moses, that you've learned to maybe see them differently than you have in the past, maybe to come at them in a different light. I realize that reading Leviticus and Numbers isn't necessarily just going to be a walk in the park or a fun thing to do all the time, but with a Christological lens, understanding this crimson thread of redemption that God has woven throughout his book, that we can see just exactly what God is doing through this book and the way it points to Jesus, and how we can learn to love him, to love God more through what he's said. We're going to close there. Here's what I want you to do. Next week in class, just tell me that you've watched the lecture. Don't lie. If you haven't watched the lecture, don't tell me you've watched the lecture, of course. But watch the lecture. Tell me you have. I'll just give you full credit for the discussion, since we clearly can't have the discussion, but it's part of the grade rather than putting more weight on the other weeks. Get the reading done. And if there's any particular questions you have about Deuteronomy, something you want to ask, you can either ask them next week when we do Joshua and Judges, or you can also use the discussion section under the discussion post for the Deuteronomy lecture where I posted the video. You can ask questions in there and we can discuss them if there's some questions, something you want to ask about. So, all right, I hope this works. I hope this all saves and you're able to watch it. And I will see you when I get back. All right, everyone have a good night.